Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free to play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. So, this is the Deck Building Toolbox series. We're talking about red today in Wild's Veldrain. The basic idea is we are going to find a wide array of cards that can go into a wide array of decks, and some of the cards we talk about today might be the kernels of deck ideas that maybe aren't as widely applicable but have some neat interactions. Let's get into it. So, Embereth Veteran. This is a Savannah Lions, a 2-1 for 1. And you can, at instant speed, pay 1, sacrifice it, and create a young hero role token attached to another creature. I think this is one of the only roles that doesn't give +1/+1 immediately. So you can't sacrifice her to save another creature necessarily. But the other creature that gets the young hero role token gets this ability whenever the creature attacks. If its toughness is 3 or less, put a +1/+1 counter on it. In an aggressive red deck full of small creatures, you probably have some things with 3 toughness or less. Most of the time you're happy to just keep attacking with the veteran, let it trade in combat. If you happen to have 1 mana open and the opponent points a piece of removal at this, then you can get a young hero role token. That's, nice little upside. And there could be other kinds of decks this could go into aside from aggro. Anytime you've got like an aristocrats kind of build where you want to sacrifice creatures to trigger some other effect, this is putting more value onto the battlefield as it sacrifices. For example, you could have a deck with Ghoulish Procession in it, and Embereth Veteran is a non-token creature. It would trigger this. It's kind of a different angle, different way of thinking about the card. And anytime you've got a card like that where you can start to think about other possibilities of other kinds of decks it might go into, that's a good sign. That means it might be a useful tool in your toolbox. Alright, Harried Spearguard. Similarly to the Embereth Veteran, so this is a good aggressive early drop, right? 1/1s with haste have been playable in many a format. When this one dies, you get a rat that can't block. So it's a pretty good, go wide attacker, where you don't care so much when it dies because you get another attacker you can attack wide with the next turn. And similarly to the Embereth Veteran, it's maybe got some play in an aristocrat style build where you want to sacrifice your own creatures. So, yeah, I think the Spearguard is worth looking at. Monstrous Rage. If you've been on the ladder much recently, you may have seen this card already. So, a target creature effectively gets +3/+1 in trample, because the monster roll token gives it +1/+1 in trample. It's a pretty big boost. It can let your creatures trade up in combat. You may or may not be able to save it with the 1 toughness, but, maybe. So there's, and it's especially good with prowess, right? It's triggering prowess. It's already giving a big boost. Now, I don't know that you want 4 copies of it necessarily, but maybe. Depending on how aggressive your deck is. You need a good density of threats to be able to deploy this card. As long as you do, though, could be what you're looking for. Torch the Tower. This is, I believe, just better than Blessed Bolt. Blessed Bolt was from either Crimson Vow or Midnight Hunt. It's 1 red instant, deals 2 damage to a creature or planeswalker, exile it instead. This does all of that. And then you can also bargain it If you bargain, it deals 3 damage and you scry 1. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily better than the spell that we got in Kamigawa, where you can sacrifice an artifact specifically and deal 4 damage. If artifacts are what you're sacrificing, then that spell might be better for you. But Torch the Tower is not a bad option, and the Exile is a nice clause to add on here. As to whether, you're sacrificing tokens or enchantments, or whether you might like to look into the Voltage Surge, it's up to you whether your deck would rather have Torch the Tower or Voltage Surge. They're both good cards. Torch the Tower can sacrifice, tokens and enchantments. But if artifacts are what you're sacrificing, then you've got a little bit of a choice to make here. This one deals more damage. This one exiles things. And you get a scry. It's up to you. Ratcatcher Trainee. This card is interesting. So, you can get it down as an aggressive 2-drop. It's not great in that regard, but it's not terrible. It has first strike on your turn, which means it's somewhat difficult to block. If you can hold it just a moment for a little bit of value, then you can cast it as Pest Problem first, and then you still get an aggressive 2-drop later. The card by itself can put 3 bodies onto the field with 4 power for a total of 5 mana paid in installments. It plays well into Rat synergies, plays well into Aristocrats synergies. It's maybe not the best, it's maybe not the worst. I'm always looking at cards that have extra value packed onto them, and adventures always catch my eye for this reason. So, could be worth experimenting with. We'll see. Tattered Ratter, you don't want too many effects like this in a creature type deck, where it's a card that is a payoff card, but it's not the actual creature type itself. So what I think you could maybe do is have a one-of copy of Tattered Ratter in a rat deck. So the effect is not that great in multiples because, if you got like 3 Tattered Ratters on the battlefield, the opponent will just let the rats through unblocked unless they absolutely must stop them. And if you have that many Tattered Ratters, you have less rats, right? You've drawn more cards that are not rats. So you have this 2/2 for 2 that only is good if you have other cards in your deck that make it good. All that being said, 1 copy of Tattered Ratter might make your rats trade up favorably well in combat. Only on attacks, of course. And I'm not entirely sure that even 1 copy would be good. I'm just pointing it out that 1 copy might maybe be good, especially when you're in the budget days of your account. You don't have a lot of rare and mythic wild cards to throw around. Could be alright. Flick a Coin. This effect has been printed into red since almost the dawn of time. I think originally there was a card called Flare. It's 3 mana, deals 1 damage to something, you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. And then there have been, ones where you draw the card immediately. There's been different variations on this one. I think there was one just back in Crimson Vow, where if you control a vampire, it costs 1 less. Now we've got Flick a Coin. Flick a Coin makes treasure. My biggest problem with this card is actually Thalia. Thalia is something you would love to kill with this card, but you can't actually do that because Thalia makes this card cost 4 mana. And paying 4 mana to do this effect to kill Thalia, I mean, you would do it if you had to, but you might not be alive at that point. Or the opponent may have found a pump effect by then to make the Thalia bigger because you've given them too much time. There's just a lot of problems there, right? And she's one of the premier targets that you would love to kill with a spell like this. And you can't, really. It's not a good proposition. That being said, there are other 1-toughness things you can pick off in Standard. Sometimes you could pick off a Wandering Emperor, right? It's 1 damage to any target. So Wandering Emperor comes down, exiles one of your attackers, you ping it for 1, get a treasure, draw a card. That seems okay. It's hard to hold open 3 mana, though. It's nice that it pays you back a treasure and a card. So, if you want to try to make this card work, that's up to you. I'm not convinced, but it's interesting. Minecart Daredevil, I'm not convinced about this card either. I do like adventure cards, though. The pump spell aspect of the adventure works very nicely with prowess. So if you've got some early prowess creatures, you could play this for the pump spell, and then you still end up with this 4 power creature for 3 mana, which, you know, it dies very easily to almost anything. Not a cut down, though. But the opponent has to respect it. They have to deal with it, because it's a pretty quick clock. So, I don't know that it's necessarily worth a slot in your deck or anything, but, I've seen worse. There's some silly stuff that gets played into prowess decks just because you can trigger prowess and kill the opponent faster. And this card is pretty aggressive. I might experiment with it. Unruly Catapult, we've got effects like this in Thermo Alchemist and some other similar cards. This one only triggers off of instants and sorceries. That untaps it. You get a blocker, you know, a defender. And it can deal damage straight to the opponent's face. You know, kind of forms a combo with instant and sorcery cards. At 3 mana, it's probably not very good. It's a reasonable blocking presence on the battlefield. It does unfortunately die to a cut down. There's some things it does not die to, though. If your opponent's playing a red deck, then you have to block a creature in combat, which stops damage to your face. Then they have to burn this out, which also stops damage to your face. Could be worse. It's at 3 mana, it's probably not quite right, but it's still an interesting option. Grabby Giant's pretty good. You can make a treasure at instant speed for 2 that ramps you. It doesn't ramp you as permanently as a land would have, but then you get the Grabby Giant later, which is a 4/3 with reach for 4, can sack artifacts and lands to draw cards. It's really not the worst. And if you had nothing better to do, then you could play the adventure on 2 and play the giant on 3. That would not be great. That wouldn't be a great use of your time and treasure, probably, but at least you'd be getting a 4 power creature on turn 3. Blocking flyers does matter. All the way around, this card's not bad. Corvold and the Noble Thief, this card probably costs too much mana. But Chapter 3 on this card is what interests me. So it makes treasure tokens, so it is ramping you up. Now, it doesn't get down until turn 4. So the ramping that it's doing is getting you to 5, 6, 7 drops. Or it's giving you other colors of mana that you can play your opponent's cards with. Because we have a couple of cards in this set that don't let you spend the mana as though it were mana of any color. This is one of them. That's what the treasures are for. So, exiling the top 3 cards of the opponent's library, it's a mill in a sneaky little way. If you don't play the cards, they're just gone forever. And if you can play the cards, you know, it's coming from a saga, so you've got all your mana available when the ability goes off. You know, you're pretty likely to hit a land drop, a spell of some kind. I like effects like this. Back in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, there was a red spell called Interrogate the Prisoners, I think. It was an instant for 2 in red. You could either destroy an artifact, right, to free the prisoners, or you could exile the top 3 cards of the opponent's library, and I think you could play them until the end of your next turn. Something like that. I liked that card. I used it all the time. As a source of card advantage, a source of mill, blows up artifacts. That was a great card. This one, maybe not as much. But I'm curious. I'm curious about effects like this where you can steal the opponent's things and mill them at the same time. It's an interesting ability that's sneaking into red. And I'd kind of like to see where it goes from here. As for this card, I'll be experimenting with it. It probably is not good enough at the end of the day. Witchstalker Frenzy. So this can deal 5 damage to target Sheoldred. It's a red spell, it deals with Sheoldred. It gets cheaper for each creature that attacked this turn, and that can be your creatures or the opponent's creatures. So there's every possibility you could pay this for 1 or 2 mana. And at that rate, it's pretty good. Pretty good spot removal. I don't know if you want all 4 copies of it, but yeah, this seemed like a pretty reasonable card. Bellowing Bruiser is interesting because normally these spells that make creatures unable to block never, ever, ever make it into standard decks. But this one is attached to a 4/4 with haste. Now, in an aggressive deck, there's only so many 5-drops that you want to be playing. So I would look at this card as maybe a potential one-of in a budget red deck. If you're on a budget, this is not a bad top end to, finish off the opponent with some more haste. It could also maybe finish the opponent off by getting past their blockers at 3 mana. Either way, could be doing what your aggressive deck wants to be doing. If you have more rare and mythic wild cards, you probably don't need this one, but it doesn't seem at all unreasonable to me. Two-headed Hunter. This has twice the rage. You can give a creature double strike until end of turn. 2 mana instants about the going rate on this effect, and you get this 5/4 Menace body attached to it later. Could be a neat way to finish the opponent off. If you'd be inclined to play double strike cards anyway, this is probably better than your other options. And is probably a reasonable include as a one-of in most kind of aggressive decks that are on a budget. And we got Hearth Elemental. This is just an uncommon. So it can draw you 2 cards. There are times where your hand is irrelevant, there are times where your hand is all mountains, and there are times when your hand is just empty. And you can stoke Genius to draw 2 for 2 mana, and that's a great deal. You might also be able to get the Hearth Elemental down for a lot less than 6 mana. It costs X less to cast, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard that are instants, sorceries, or have adventures. So far, people have struggled to make this one really click, but I think the potential is still there. I still think it's worth experimenting with. I still think there could be a deck. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and craft some cards here. On to the rares and mythics. Song of Totentans. This is like a fireball, in that it can deal a point of damage to the opponent for every point of X. Power Dragon calls it Furball, because it makes a bunch of rats. And it's like a fireball. Seems like the shoe fits. So yeah, the rats can't block. It also gives creatures you control haste until end of turn. I have seen at least one person use this card to give something haste that wasn't a rat that came from the song. So, like, that could be especially good maybe with a saga creature from Kamigawa. Flips in and it's, doesn't have haste already. The song could give it haste. Overall, this card seems really good. It puts a ton of bodies on the field that can go ahead and attack in, and if you have even the slightest way to pump them up, it turns lethal very quickly. It can be pretty lethal anyway. Playing this where X is 2 or 3 is not unreasonable as long as you're getting in on the board. And obviously if X is like 7 or 8, then the opponent can't take a whole lot of that. Yeah, great card. Charming Scoundrel. So, this is a pretty great 2-drop in red. She comes down with haste. You can choose one, discard and draw. So that could be useful if you're a Reanimator type of deck, or you just are searching for something specific to close out the game or answer something. You can make a treasure, so she can ramp you. And you get a body and a treasure and a 1/1 attacker all at 2 mana. Seems pretty good. You can also put a Wicked Roll token on a creature you control. If nothing else, she can put the Wicked Roll on herself, which gives +1/+1, and when the aura goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. So, 2/2s for 2 with haste in red are playable. They're good, solid playable cards. Felden sees play. Bloodthirsty Adversary sees play. Charming Scoundrel will see play. It's a good card. If you want to run it, craft it. And it can help you out even in slightly less aggressive decks by ramping you, or, draw and discard. Raging Battle Mouse. So this is a card that's scary if it sticks around for any length of time. And if you play it on turn 3, it can let you easily double spell with another 2-drop. And when you get 2 or more non-land permanents that enter the battlefield, as long as you do it before combat, then target creature you control gets +1/+1 till end of turn. Which means this card is often putting out 3 power worth of damage. And it's often netting you extra mana as well. And, you have to play 2 spells a turn or get 2 permanents a turn to do those effects. But it's not hard to do in the opening turns of the game, and there might not be any later turns of the game if you're doing that. I think this card's probably really good. I think we're going to see people continue to experiment with it throughout its tenure here in Standard. Godric, Cloaked Reveler. So, when Adventures in the Forgotten Realms was out, there was a Bugbear. That was just a 3/3 for 3 with haste. That's all it did. I ran that as a budget option in a, red aggro deck and killed a lot of people with that card. Now, unfortunately, Godric is legendary, so you can't get 2 of them down. But you might be able to turn him into a fire-breathing dragon. Has added upside. So, I think all the way around that Godric is a very playable card. You probably don't need 4 copies of him. As I said, he's legendary. And it's a question of how many 3-drops you want in an aggressive red deck. But 1 or 2 copies of Godric seems easy, for sure. Redcap Gutter Dweller. This card, maybe not. Hasn't quite found a home in rats, exactly. The rat deck might not need this card, but it can use this card. It does make rats, and it, gives you this menace creature that can keep growing and drawing you cards in the red way. You could also run this in other decks as an Aristocrats engine to sacrifice creatures. To make this bigger and draw cards in the red way, because maybe you've got some other scheme up your sleeve for sacrificing creatures. Maybe you have lots of triggers and benefits that go off when that happens. So I think this card has applications outside of the rat deck, and that's why I'm bringing it up here. Anything that puts 5 power onto the table, can grow over time, and can draw you cards, I think it's worth looking at. Alright, Virtue of Courage. So this is a pretty reasonable spell just because of the Embereth Blaze. 2 mana instant, deals 2 damage to any target. It's double the price of a shock, but it comes stapled onto this other card. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, it doesn't have to be a non-creature, right? As long as it's not combat damage. It's like your Thermo Alchemists, and, if you have something that ETBs and hits the opponent's face, stuff like that. You can exile that many cards from the top of your library and play those cards this turn. That's neat. You could see a ton of extra cards that way. You only have until the end of turn to play them. But as long as you can keep burning the opponent's face. This can just kind of snowball away the whole game. And probably the cards you're going to keep playing are more things that burn the opponent's face, which means that the game should end. I don't know if this goes into every kind of deck, but any deck that's dealing some non-combat damage to the opponent can be looking at this. Yeah, it doesn't have to be mono-red decks either. I could easily imagine like Rakdos decks, Izzet decks, blue-red, blue-black. Anything that, if you're able to trigger the Virtue of Courage much at all, then this quickly becomes a pretty useful spell just because it's got the 2-mana mode on it. Ogre Chitterlord, I have good news for you. If you have bought the Mastery Pass, then eventually, if you play long enough, get enough experience, you will unlock 4 copies of the Ogre Chitterlord. Now as to whether or not this card is good. It puts out 8 power of creatures. It's a 6/5 with menace. It makes 2 rats that can't block. Then if you control 5 or more rats, each rat you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So, is there a way you could build the rat deck that wants a big top end on it? I'm not sure. You know, you'd be ramping a little bit more. Song of Totentans just keeps getting better the more mana you have. So I don't think it's impossible that you could find a deck, a rat deck that goes bigger on its mana curve. That doesn't seem crazy to me. The guy, he could come down and just end the game, right? If you have 3 other rats, then you'd be attacking for at least 9, right? If those rats are 1/1s. And the card is not the worst on its own because it's a giant menace creature, puts out 8 power and 7 toughness worth of stats across 3 bodies. Yeah, we demand so much of our 6 mana cards now in Standard. I mean, everything about this card looks playable to me. Looks perfectly reasonable, looks like there would be a deck for it. It might just be that the rest of Magic has kind of run away to the point that you can't do that now. But I'm at least willing to try. I'm willing to see if this card can get there. Unfortunately, I'm not really willing to spend wild cards on it because I want to unlock it for free from the mastery tree, so it's going to be a while until I get to experiment with it. Realm Scorcher Hellkite. It's a big dragon. It's got flying and haste. It's a 4/6 for 6. You can bargain. And if you did bargain, you had 4 mana in any combination of colors. It also has an activated ability of a red and a colorless. Realm Scorcher Hellkite deals 1 damage to any target. So, at the very least, if you bargain it, then it can shoot 2 damage wherever you like. But you might be able to double spell, right? You might be able to bargain this and then cast, I don't know, Beseech the Mirror. And then maybe you get a Shoulder It. I don't know. There can be other uses for that mana. It's mana of any color. And, you know, this dragon is maybe not the most exciting, but it's large, it has haste, it can definitely fly in and into the game. If you bargain it, it can deal at least 6 damage. Overall, I think this is fine. It's fine. It could be good for some deck. Definitely you want to try to get the use of the bargain out of it. I think it's probably a little subpar if you can't get the bargain. Alright, it's time to spend a couple of wild cards here. I'm going to go ahead and get the 4th copy of Song of Totentans here. It doesn't have to go in rat decks. This can be a finisher in all kinds of different decks, token decks, or even, I don't know, a control deck, maybe. Charming Scoundrel seems very useful, just widely applicable, so I'm going to go ahead and craft a copy. I'm curious to see what the Redcap Gutter Dweller can do. And not just in rats. I'm genuinely curious if this might have a home in some Aristocrats pile. So, I'm going to go ahead and craft a copy here. For my Mythic, I'm going to craft a Virtue of Courage. I think, this isn't quite as much of a slam dunk as the virtue of persistence. You need some consideration of deck building for the virtue of courage, but I still think it's a really good card that's not that hard to find a home for. So I'm going to go ahead and craft the third one here. Alright, that's it for today. So join me next time. We'll be talking about green, my favorite color. And then we'll move on to multicolor, and that'll wrap up Wilds of Eldraine for the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. Please like and subscribe. Check out my other videos. That one's even more important than liking them. I mean, subscribing's also nice. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.